The War of the Roses was a dynastic conflict that took place in England between the years 1455 and 1487. The main belligerents of the war were the rival branches of the House Plantagenet, House Lancaster, and House York. The fighting was spread out across 32 years, with long periods of peace between clashes. The War of the Roses would become one of the most influential moments in English history. It would inspire artists of the future to create timeless classics and would lead to the weakening of feudal power as well as the unification of both houses under the Tudor dynasty. To understand the reasons why the War of the Roses took place, we must go back to the year 1399 when the current king, Richard II, also known as Richard of Bordeaux, was in power. He was 10 years old when his grandfather, King Edward III, died. Edward was a strong king, and it was he who began the 100 Years' War. By contrast, Richard was considered a weak king. He was known only to take counsel from a small group of advisors and cared little for the concerns of the aristocracy. He was known to execute people who he considered traitors and would exile people who were known to be troublemakers. One of them was his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Henry's father was John of Gaunt, the uncle to Richard and his most trusted advisor. John of Gaunt was also loved by many of the nobles of England who saw him as a reasonable and respectable soldier. He acted as regent before Richard came to age and continued to have a key role at court. His son was playmates with Richard and had grown up together, but Henry also spoke his mind and sometimes spoke aloud about his dissatisfaction with some of the king's policies. He would be exiled for this offence until the death of his father, which occurred a year after his exile. Instead of receiving his inheritance, Richard revoked Henry's right to the land and ordered that he must ask for them back. Insulted and enraged, Henry met other disillusioned and disaffected nobles and invaded England. The original goal was to gain his lands by force, but once he realised that many of the nobles of England supported him, he declared himself King Henry IV. He imprisoned Richard, who eventually died in his cell. It is generally agreed that Henry Bolingbroke was the first member of the House of Lancaster, as his father was first Duke of Lancaster. Richard's presumed heir, Edmund, 1st Duke of York, was skipped over in favour of Henry's children. This action would lead to the establishment of the House of York. Though a few plots did take place during Henry's reign, they did not bear any fruit, and for the most part, members of House York were loyal to the crown. When Henry died, his son, also called Henry, would ascend to the throne and become known as Henry V. Henry V's reign would become legendary due to his famous victory against the French at Agincourt and the apparent surrender of the French crown to Henry. But Henry would die before he could enjoy his conquest, and his infant son would become king. Henry VI was only 9 months old when he became King of England. For the first 16 years of his reign, a regency council would rule the kingdom. It was headed by Henry's uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. He was considered the perfect example of how a king should be. He was courageous and chivalrous, as well as learned and cultural. He was also extremely loyal to his brother, Henry V, and so when he died, he saw it as his right to be the guardian of his brother's son. Sadly for the realm, Henry VI did not become the warrior king like his father. He instead became a shy and religious man who was repulsed by the deceitful nature of court intrigue, and so allowed influential nobles to take over matters of court. Even the influential Duke of Gloucester could not navigate the twists and turns of the court, and was eventually arrested on charges of treason against the king, although he would die before his trial could take place. By 1450, clear divisions in the English court began to show between the supporters of Edmund Beaufort, 2nd Duke of Somerset, and Richard of York, 3rd Duke of York. The Duke of Somerset became the most influential man at court due to the Duke's close relationship with Queen Margaret, who hated the Duke of York just as much as Somerset. They both did not want to see a member of the House of York on the English throne, and made sure that any attempt to name Richard as Henry's heir was suppressed. Richard knew there was no way to gain the king's favour through traditional means, and so in 1452 he marched on London with one demand: remove the Duke of Somerset from court. But it turned out he misjudged the current feeling of the nobles and was isolated. He eventually submitted to the king and was imprisoned for nearly 2 years. He was eventually released and found that the political climate had got a lot more hostile. Many of the noble families had grown tired with the domination of Somerset and the Lancastrians at court. Richard took advantage of this by declaring that he wished for more reform within the government. In 1453, the king suffered a mental breakdown that meant he could not rule his kingdom. It was so severe that he could not even recognise his own family. A regency council was set up with Richard at its head, and was named Lord Protector. He quickly replaced many of the Lancastrian courtiers with Yorkists and imprisoned the Duke of Somerset, but his power would soon slip away when Henry recovered from his illness and took over duties of rule. Margaret made sure that Richard was forced out of court and only Lancastrians could have the king's ear. It became clear to Richard and the Yorkists that all peaceful routes had disappeared and that there was only one option: armed conflict. On the 22nd of May 1455, the First Battle of St Albans took place. It was a relatively small battle, with only 160 casualties, but its significance was massive, as it marks the beginning of the War of the Roses. During the battle, nearly all the leaders of the Lancastrians were killed. This included the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Northumberland. The Yorkists also captured King Henry along with the Duke of Buckingham. Richard escorted the king back to London, where he was named Lord Protector of England. Margaret was now seen as a leader of the Lancastrian faction, although she had very little power. For the next 5 years there would be a flimsy peace between the two factions. There was no outward aggression between them, and there was even several attempts to reconcile with each other. The only obstacle was the Queen, who did not want her son, Edward, Prince of Wales, removed from the succession in favour of Richard. Eventually, Richard would be relieved from duty as Lord Protector and made Lieutenant of Ireland. Many of the reforms that Richard put in place during his time as Lord Protector were reversed, and the Queen enforced conscription in an attempt to end Richard's military dominance. The next bout of fighting would be initiated when the King ordered Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick and loyal Yorkist, back to London when he attacked Spanish ships off the coast of Calais. He failed to turn up due to claims that he was attacked on the way there, although it was probably because he feared arrest. In response, the Duke of York and several of his supporters were called to a royal council to explain the actions of Warwick, but they also refused in fear of imprisonment. Instead, York called his Neville allies to Ludlow Castle, which was considered to be one of the most strongest fortifications in England. In an attempt to stop Neville and the York armies combining, the Queen ordered Lord Audley and Lord Dudley to intercept them and crush the Nevilles before they reached Ludlow. The battle would be known as the Battle of Blore Heath and would be a Yorkist victory. The battle claimed up to 3,000 casualties, most of them being Lancastrian. As well as losing the battle, the general of the Lancastrians, Lord Audley, was slain and his second-in-command, Lord Dudley, was taken prisoner. But this would all be for naught when on October the 12th, 1459, the Lancastrians would defeat the Yorkists at Ludford Bridge. The reason the Yorkists lost was because many of their army defected to the king's side. With no support, Richard, Warwick and Neville fled to Ireland and Calais. Soon after, all of the Yorkist supporters were denounced as traitors and ordered to surrender to the king, although he had very little power outside the English mainland. The defeat at Ludford did not mark the end of the Yorkist cause. In Ireland, Richard and his supporters planned the invasion of the southern coast. This was because many of the nobles and people of the southern coast supported Richard due to his promises of reforming the government. In June 1460, Richard and his supporters invaded the southern coast of England and peacefully occupied Kent and London. The people of London supported Richard's actions and welcomed him like a hero. In response, the king led an army south to confront the Yorkists and crush them once and for all. The Battle of Northampton was a disastrous defeat for Lancastrians, and much like the Battle of St Albans, it led to the death of nearly all the Lancastrian nobles and would end with the king's capture. The Earl of Warwick led the king to the Tower of London in order to make the garrison surrender to the Yorkists. Richard jumped on his chance to be proclaimed king and used the illegitimacy of the Lancastrian line as a pretext to his ascension to the throne, but his supporters were reluctant to replace King Henry, with many of them only wishing to get rid of the Lancastrian members of court and gain land from former Lancastrian nobles. But even so, many did accept that Richard's claims were more legitimate than Henry's, and so made a compromise called the Act of Accord. This act stated that Richard would be recognised as Henry's successor, and that upon the king's death, Richard and his offspring would ascend to the throne. He was also named Protector of the Realm, and he ruled the whole of England. The Queen and her son fled to Lancastrian-held areas of Wales and North England in an attempt to stop the Scottish from supporting Richard. Eventually, with the support of the Scottish, the Lancastrians made moves near Wakefield. In response, Richard and his son, Edmund, along with his Neville allies, led an army north in an attempt to deter the Lancastrians from making an attack. What ended up was a decisive victory for the Lancastrians, and it would be known as the Battle of Wakefield. Richard, Edmund and Lord Neville would all be killed, and the majority of the Yorkist force was crushed. The Queen ordered the heads of Richard and his supporters to be displayed over the gates of York. With the death of Richard, his son Edward, Earl of March, was named Duke of York and leader of the Yorkist armies. He immediately met the Lancastrians at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, crushing them and slaying Sir Owen Tudor, grandfather of the future king, Henry VII. But the Yorkist victory at Mortimer's Cross will be overshadowed by their defeat at the Second Battle of St Albans, where the Yorkists suffered 4,000 casualties while the Lancastrians only suffered 2,000. One of the other major developments at St Albans was the reclamation of the king by the Lancastrian forces, with him being found in his tent abandoned. Instead of finding the friendly welcome they thought they would receive, the Lancastrians were shut out of London, with people refusing to arm and supply the Queen and her army. Emboldened by his victory at Mortimer's Cross, and with the news that London was resisting the Lancastrians, Edward rendezvoused with the remnants of Warwick's army from St Albans and marched towards London in the hope of meeting the Lancastrians in battle. The Queen and her army retreated north to friendly territory while Edward entered London. There, Edward found crowds cheering for him and not only supporting him in the war, but backing his claim as King of England. In London, he pronounced that he would not be coronated until Henry was defeated outright, claiming that Henry had forfeited the crown when he took up arms against the rightful heirs that was set out in the Act of Accord. Edward's army marched north in order to meet the Lancastrians in battle and crush them. On the way there, his army would swell to the impressive size of 30,000 men. They met the Lancastrian army at their staging ground, the village of Towton. The Battle of Towton would be the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, with up to 28,000 dead and an unknown amount injured. The battle would also be a decisive Yorkist victory, with a complete destruction of Lancastrian authority and power. Many leading Lancastrian nobles were killed and the royal family fled to Scotland. The Lancastrian nobles that did not flee submitted to Edward and recognised him as king, further legitimising Edward's claim to the crown. When Edward reached York, he replaced the heads of his father and brother with Lancastrian heads, including John Clifford, the man who was blamed with the death of his brother. In June 1461, Edward was crowned Edward IV and the first king of House of York. During this period, the last Lancastrian holdouts would be conquered and the few Lancastrian nobles that were left exiled. The most important development that would take place would be the capture of King Henry at Clitheroe after a failed Lancastrian uprising. King Henry was taken to the Tower of London, where he would remain the prisoner for over 5 years. Edward and the Scottish would reconcile with each other, leading to the exile of the Queen and her son, Edward Prince of Wales, from Scotland. They fled to France, where King Charles VII would grant them asylum. All looked well for the Yorkist monarchy. They ruled England with an iron fist, they had ousted most of the Lancastrian nobles, and had the full support of the church and state. But the cracks would start to show. In 1464, Warwick, now the richest and most powerful man in England, proposed a marriage between Edward and a relative of the French king. He wanted to make sure that all avenues for invasion were closed off so that the Lancastrians could never again endanger England. Edward had other ideas and instead married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of a Lancastrian noble. Warwick was humiliated, his important and public work up in flames, and his council refused. This would be the start of the rising resentment between Warwick and Edward. Edward would start to favour the Woodvilles at court, and many of the offices and estates that were promised to the Nevilles were given over to the Woodvilles. And then when Warwick proposed a match between his daughters and Edward's two brothers, George and Richard, he refused. Over the course of 5 years, Warwick would turn from staunch loyalist to rebellious plotter. In 1469, Warwick and Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, defied the king's orders and married Clarence to Warwick's daughter, Isabella. The king raised an army in anticipation of revolt, but was defeated at Edgecote Moor by forces loyal to Warwick. Edward was eventually captured and imprisoned at Middleham Castle. Warwick then had the Queen's father and one of her brothers executed. Warwick and Clarence's victory over Edward did not lead to the king being ousted. It instead led to Edward reconciling with them and giving the blessing to the marriage, but peace would not last for long. When Edward suppressed the Lancastrian uprising in Lincolnshire, he announced that they were under the orders of Warwick and Clarence, and then promptly declared them traitors. Warwick and Clarence would flee to France in order to evade arrest and execution. On arrival to the French court, they lobbied King Louis of France to fund an invasion of England to gain their lands back. There was bad blood between Louis and Edward due to the latter's alliance with the Duke of Burgundy, Louis' sworn enemy. Louis instead proposed an alliance between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou. At first, they did not see eye to eye. Warwick was responsible for the defeat of the Lancastrians in countless battles, and Margaret was responsible for the deaths of Clarence's father, Richard, and his brother Edmund. But they both realised that despite their differences, they wanted the same thing: the deposition of Edward and the reinstatement of Henry VI. To seal the alliance, Warwick married his daughter Anne to Margaret's son Edward, who was also Henry's heir. With the backing of France, Warwick and Clarence invaded England during the final months of the year 1470. Edward was unprepared. He did not expect Warwick and Clarence to join the Lancastrians, and certainly didn't expect them to have as many soldiers as they did. To make matters worse, he, along with most of his army, was in the north suppressing a rebellion. With no forces guarding the south, it soon fell to Warwick. By October, Warwick had captured London and had freed Henry from his captivity. He was quickly restored to the throne and made his son, Prince Edward, heir to the throne. King Edward attempted to rally his armies and head south to crush Warwick, but he was soon betrayed by one of his most powerful lords, John Neville, who happened to be Warwick's brother. Edward, seeing no other way to defeat Warwick, fled with his brother Richard to Burgundy, ending his 9-year reign. Warwick, bolstered by his victory over Edward, planned to make war against Burgundy in the hopes of gaining Dutch land. This action would lead to his downfall. Charles, Duke of Burgundy, discovered this and backed Edward's claim to the throne with money, men and ships. Edward, now with an army, invaded England in 1471, claimed that he had arrived to take back the land granted to him as Duke of York and that he had no interest in replacing Henry. But when York opened the gates to him, along with many of the northern lords, it became clear that he had come for his crown. To make matters worse for Warwick, Clarence switched sides and joined his brother in rebellion. This meant a large portion of his force had been taken away from him. Warwick, not ready for a confrontation, left London, which soon fell to Edward's forces. But Warwick bolstered his army with men from Exeter, Oxford and the Welsh Marshes. Both armies met north of the town of Chipping Barnet. The Battle of Barnet would be a victory for the Yorkists, despite the Lancastrians having twice as many men. Warwick and John Neville would be killed during the battle and the Lancastrian army collapsed due to rumours of traitors within their ranks. Warwick was cut down when he tried to flee the battlefield. The defeat of the Lancastrians at Barnet should have been the final battle of Warwick's rebellion, but Margaret, sick of fleeing and sure of victory, rallied the remaining Lancastrian lords and invaded Wales. But when she reached Gloucester, she was rejected passage through the city and instead had to go round. This was when the Yorkists caught them at Tewkesbury. Tewkesbury would be a disaster for House Lancaster and would lead to the extinction of the dynasty. Prince Edward would die on the battlefield, Margaret was captured and all the Lancastrian lords were killed or exiled, and their last bastion of support, Wales, surrendered. A week after the victory at Tewkesbury, Henry was murdered by his captive Yorkists. No one knows who ordered the death of Henry. Historians tend to agree that it was King Edward, but who seized a chance to wipe out House Lancaster and cement his rule. House Lancaster was destroyed, and House York was seen as the true heirs to the Plantagenet dynasty. The next 14 years would be the most peaceful England had been for 30 years. With the destruction of House Lancaster, there was very few convincing pretenders to the throne, and many had grown tired of war and the cost it brings. This does not mean that there was no bloodshed. Edward had never fully forgiven his brother George, Duke of Clarence, for his rebellious actions with Warwick, and would eventually have him executed under the charges that he was conspiring with traitors. Also within the court was the growing resentment between Richard and the members of the Woodville family, who after Warwick's rebellion had gained even more power. But none of these disagreements would lead to direct conflict, as Edward made sure the feuds between nobles were suppressed. All these issues would come to a head when on the 9th of April 1483 Edward would die suddenly at the age of 40. At the time of Edward's death, Richard had been north, and the Queen's brother, Earl Rivers, was at Ludlow Castle, tutoring the young princes, Edward and Richard. When the news arrived, both of them raced to London in order to make sure that the other did not proclaim themselves protector of the realm. Richard, with the backing of Lord Hastings and Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, made it to London first. They imprisoned Earl Rivers and had his nephew Thomas Grey executed on charges of treason against Prince Edward, and executed Rivers shortly after. Edward was proclaimed Edward V, but his reign would not last long. In an attempt to find refuge from Richard and his supporters, Elizabeth Woodville, former Queen of England, went to Lord Hastings for help. He was a friend of the former King Edward, and he was seen as a compassionate man who would help his friend's children. In response, Richard declared Hastings a traitor and had him executed. Richard, now the most powerful man in England, made his move against Elizabeth. With the help of Robert Stillingen, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, they claimed that Elizabeth's marriage to Edward had been illegitimate due to Edward's earlier marriage with Eleanor Talbot, which had been consummated. This meant that Edward's sons were bastards and that they weren't the rightful heirs to the throne. Parliament, who had already fallen out with the Woodvilles, backed the bishop's claims and passed the law of Titulus Regius, an act that proclaimed that the princes were illegitimate and made Richard King of England. Richard, now crowned Richard III, imprisoned the princes in the Tower, where they would never be seen again. They were most likely murdered under the orders of Richard, although some claimed that at least one of them escaped from the Tower. Richard's ascension to the throne would mark the start of the final phase of the War of the Roses. Unlike his brother, Richard was not popular, and this mainly came from the fact that he was disfigured, suffering from birth defects for his whole life. During the medieval period, any abnormalities were treated with suspicion, and it was seen as God's punishment. Also, the rumours that he murdered his nephews made him look like he was a power-hungry tyrant. The main issue for Richard was that one last Lancastrian claimant still existed, and his popularity was rising. Henry Tudor, 2nd Earl of Richmond, was born in 1457 to Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort. His claim came from his mother, who was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt. His claim came from the Lancastrian descent, and so he was seen as the final candidate by the Lancastrian loyalists. During the reign of Edward IV, he had not gained much support due to Edward being popular, and that Henry's claim was rather weak. But with the ascension of Richard and the supposed murder of the princes, Henry began to gain support from nobles who were loyal to Edward V. The first noble to rebel would be one who was instrumental in Richard's rise to power. It was the Duke of Buckingham, who for unknown reasons proclaimed Henry as rightful King of England. To this day no one knows why he did it. Some think that it was because of his anger that he was forced to kill the princes. It didn't matter, because in the end the rebellion was suppressed and Buckingham was executed for treason. It did, however, set the wheels in motion, as part of Wales and southern England were in open rebellion against Richard. Henry, now sensing that his chance had arrived, invaded England with his supporters and landed in Pembrokeshire, the place of his birth. He was quickly joined by supporters and marched into England with the support of Welsh lords. Richard's army would meet Henry south of Market Bosworth. The Battle of Bosworth Field would be the final battle that defined the War of the Roses, for it was here that the last scion of the House Plantagenet died. Richard would be betrayed by Lord Thomas Stanley, who was the stepfather to Henry. Richard would be isolated and killed by Rhys ap Thomas, a Welsh nobleman. Henry would be crowned shortly after the battle and proclaimed Henry VII, first king of the House of Tudor. To make sure that his rule was safe, he married the last member of the House of York, Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth. This unified the Lancastrians and the Yorkists into one house, and to signify this, Henry's new emblem would be a red and white rose. King Henry VII would rule for 34 years. His reign would lay down the groundwork for his son, King Henry VIII, who would become England's most famous king. Henry VII would make sure that power of nobles was suppressed and that only the king could have an army. Many of the famous figures of the war, such as Warwick and Somerset, became more powerful than kings because they could field more soldiers than them. Perhaps the most notable and immediate change was the end of the House of Plantagenet. They had ruled for over 400 years, a record that would never be beaten by any other royal dynasty. The Tudors themselves would rule just over 100 years, before transitioning to the Scottish House of Stuart.